Nauta and Freitag on fundamental neuroanatomy, it's not organized exactly the same way that I have, but it comes close. And it is really quite nice. One of the Scientific American publications, so all the illustrations are pretty. But most of all, Nauta was a really first-rate anatomist. Did most of the studies of the 40s and 50s and 60s on degenerating tracts and terminals with a stain that he modified, and a lot of work was done with good experimental psychology, so the behavioral results of the lesions were well documented. So it's a very nice book, and ought to considerably supplement the chapter I gave you from our own book. Our own book was on developmental malformations, and this just happened to be a chapter I wrote to explain why we organized the rest of the book that way. Today we come to the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the first of the suprasegmental organs that we'll talk about. We go back to the early embryo with the forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, and spinal cord segments, and sulcus limitans, and up through the spinal cord and brainstem segments with the midbrain, hindbrain, spinal segments, with the cephalic and cervical flexure, and 3 hindbrain segments. The motor plate, of course, the association plate. In the middle and anterior hindbrain segments, we have a proliferation of cells on the association plate that go up as the flocculonodular lobe and the rest of the cerebellum, which overshadows the middle hindbrain portion. And of course you'll remember this is the vestibular nucleus region of the sentinel segment. If we look at this in a cross-section, rather than a sagittal section, we'll see something like this, where we have a midline and a sulcus limitans, and then out to the lateral wall of the fourth ventricle, sulcus limitans. And this roof plate, which roofs over the dilated fourth ventricle, is the tissue in which the cerebellum is going to grow. Here we have the sulcus limitans and the motor and association plate spread out medial-laterally, in contrast to the spinal cord segments where the penile canal is much smaller than the dorsal. Out at the edge here we have the alar lip, which is an extension laterally of the association plate, and is the region where the proliferation of cells occurs for the cerebellum to grow on either side and eventually meet the midline. The cerebellum, like all golf, can be divided into 3 stages, stage 1, 2, and 3. In stage 1 is that related to the vestibular nucleus, flocculonodular lobe. and is the most primitive to develop, to allow particularly animals who don't have to move very much, like to know which way is up and down. Gravity system. It's not until later in development, with development of tails that wiggle, and fins that can also wiggle but also break, and guide fish turning, that we have a spino-trigeminal stage, stage 2, which is the main reason why it develops from the anterior hindbrain. And then stage 3 is going to be the forebrain, which we mentioned, the cortical cerebellar system, and greatly overshadows the first 2 stages. As these alar proliferations grow towards the midline, they fuse first rostrally, so that there is a zippering together of the 2 sides from front to back, so that the last part to fuse in human development is actually the first stage, nodulus. It's this pattern of zippering together in the midline to form the vermis that fails in the Dandy-Walker syndrome. In which the sagittal section gives the diagnosis away, because the only vermis you see is rostrally, and then it explodes out of a great big cyst of the 4th ventricle, and the whole posterior fossa is large, the whole head is large, the hydrocephalus, and that's one of the easy ways of remembering how the vermis forms. See how it didn't form. The other major development, maldevelopment of this region, is the armacchiaria. In which the posterior part of this 4th ventricle slides down over the cervical flexure. And if the cerebellum continues to develop normally, and the nodulus fuses, which it almost always does, the nodulus then is caught in this caudally displaced roof of the 4th ventricle and forms a knuckle, usually blind end because the jaundice foramen doesn't develop, and we have a very characteristic tail of nodulus, choroid plexus, in that region of the foramen magnum, and caudally over the upper cervical cord. There are some interesting hypotheses as to how that maldevelopment occurred. And one, the earliest ones, was that the spinal cord was tethered by the ligament which almost always, 95% of the time, accompanies the malformation. And is, you recall from the first talk, at the site of the posterior neuroport, failed to close in the mid-lumbar region. As though that were to anchor the spinal cord and prevent the cervical flexure from developing normally, because the bones were growing up faster than the neural segments were allowed to go with it. The only difficulty with that is if you recognize the way the cerebellum is attached to the brain stem. You can't pull the cerebellum down. It would be something like trying to take the stalk of a mushroom and pull one of the edges down. You could invert it so the mushroom looked like what's the orange one? This like an inside-out umbrella. A very tasty one across the name. Chanterelle. It's a chanterelle mushroom. You could do that, in theory, pulling an ordinary mushroom cap inside out. But you can't pull the edge of the mushroom down that way.
Unless you pull it down before it forms. When it's still back.
If you pull it down before it forms, that's an interesting possibility. The only difficulty is that the cerebellum is a rather late developer and is up to a centimeter above the foramen magnum at the early stage when it should be caught. So the earlier you go back, the worse the problem is of trying to get the cerebellum pulled down. Still face the problem that the attachment is here rostrally, off the level of the foramen magnum. And even if you were to pull it down this way, there's no way I can see to force them, the nodulus, to close in against the path of least resistance down to the foramen magnum. But the clincher, it seems to me, is you don't need the cerebellum at all. You can have a virtually complete agenesis of the cerebellum and still have the characteristic deformity of the fourth ventricle. The roof plate, and not even necessarily choroid plexus. Roof plate itself coming down and forming a blind pouch over the cervical cord. We have sort of high up here, which is in the laser disc. So those are two major malformations related to the cerebellum. One specifically related to the failure of closure of the two hemispheres of the megadermis, and the other related to not to the cerebellum specifically, but to the fourth ventricle as its caudal position. Somehow, either the mesenchyme or the neural tissue slide with respect to each other, and it gets caught down. One, the latter, always associated practically always with a lumbar lingomyelocele. The other, essentially never so associated. So the one, the arnochiare, is in the old days open to infection and disastrous results from that. The other, essentially never a problem with infection, but a problem with other malformations that frequently coexist with it. So any problem on this early part of the cerebellum?
What are the different types of arnochiare?
Aha. All right. Who wants to volunteer? Jonathan, a radiologist. It's a favorite region for neuroradiology. How many arnochiare malformations are there?
The nomenclature is that arnochiare is one abnormality, and there are other things which have designation chiari. That arnochiare is the same as chiari 2.
Right.
And then there's a chiari 1.
Okay.
Which are, what's it called, tonsillar ectopia, low-lying tonsils. And then chiari 3, which is cervical cephalocele. Chiari 4, I don't know what it is.
hypoplasia. Which is almost totally unrelated, except that in some cases of the Chiari-2, well, in almost all cases of Chiari-2, or Chiari malformation, the cerebellum is smaller than normal. These were 4 types of cerebellar abnormalities that Chiari described. Arnold was brought into the game later by his students, Schwalbe and Bredig, who belatedly brought Arnold up to speed in the academic race in those days, turn of the century. Arnold actually showed a very nice funnel-shaped foramen magnum, but he was much more interested in the tail end, sort of a mermaid-like fusion of the lower extremities, and that was the part that he was interested in. But Schwalbe and Bredig said that he really belonged, as an Arnold Chiari malformation, and preempted Chiari's much better description of, in many cases, idea 95 or something of the total group. But tonsillar herniation was the type 1, which is what we see in almost any kind of increase in cranial pressure. May also accompany the Chiari-2, but the critical part of the Chiari-2 is the nodulus, the cerebellum, and the caudal fourth ventral. In some ways, perhaps an exaggeration of that is where this whole thing comes out with the encephalocele, cerebellar encephalocele. Instead of having the lumbar myelocele. Hypoplasia is just thrown in for good measure, being described in the text, illustrated it, but to my limited ability to translate German, didn't associate it with the rest of the malformations. But if you compare the Dandy Walker and the Chiari-2, or Arnold Chiari, in terms of the size of the posterior fossa, they're exactly opposite. The posterior fossa in Arnold Chiari is small, as though things, unless the cerebellum is also made small, it has to be forced out. Dandy Walker, posterior fossa is always big, very high, lateral sinus is high. You can make the diagnosis on a plain X-ray in the old days. Not. Anyway, any problems on this early normal, abnormal development? Well, let me grow this up to the adult again with the brain stem, midbrain, pons, vella, spinal cord, posterior hindbrain, middle, anterior midbrain, the aqueduct and fourth ventricle, auriculi, and the cerebellum. Now, like so, this is now the completed vermis. The nodulus is the most caudal portion of the vermian cortex. And coming around is the flocculus. Let me exaggerate a little bit here. With a connection between the two of white matter, which is the floccular peduncle that allows the formation of the nodulus goes to the midline, and the flocculus bends out. So we have a floccular peduncle connecting the two. And the horizontal
Lateral.
The floccular peduncle represents then a lateral extension of the most primitive of the, how many peduncles? 3, 6. Thank you. Everyone agree that 3 is the right answer this time? Well, this is one of the exceptions. 3 is not the right answer. Well, 3 is the right answer if you use the current officially approved terminology. But they made a mistake. Let me try to explain. The vestibular nucleus which is here, and intimately related to the development of the floccular nodular lobe, connects around the wall of the fourth ventricle here with the inner cerebellar peduncle. Right next to the fourth ventricle, connecting nodulus and the extension of it, the floccular peduncle. Same development. So we have the inner peduncle going that way and the floccular peduncle coming around laterally to join the floccular nodular lobe. So that's essentially one system. The next system embryologically would be the trigeminal and the old ventral spinocerebellar tract coming up into the anterior hindbrain around the main sensory nucleus and coming in over the superior peduncle, the trigeminal, and the old ventral spinocerebellar tract to begin the formation of the superior peduncle. To which is added a major outgoing tract from the deep cerebellar nuclei that goes out and crosses to the opposite mid nucleus, the thalamus. That becomes the major portion of the superior peduncle. The color's pretty fast here. The inferior peduncle, coming from the spinal cord, runs next to, just lateral to, the inner peduncle. And that's where the mistake has occurred, infusing those two, because they're quite different. But let me put in the middle peduncle, coming from the pons, crossing, coming out as the middle cerebellar peduncle, coming at right angles to the board. So we have 4 peduncles. Superior, middle, and inferior. And according to the modern terminology, that's all they need, but they've forgotten the difference between the spinocerebellar and oligocerebellar component and the vestibular. And in the older terminology, and I think the reason they dropped the old terminology for the new one was that the inner peduncle was called the juxta-restiform body, next to the restiform body, and they try to get away from all those Latin-type terminologies and fuse these two into the inferior. Dreadful mistake. Totally confuses a horizontal running set of fibers, which are almost purely vestibulocerebellar, with an ascending set of fibers that are totally unrelated, are spinocerebellar, olivocerebellar fibers, just entirely different systems. So I urge you to remember an exception to the rule of 3, that here we have 4 major peduncles: inner, stage 1, inferior, middle, and superior. The inferior being purely afferent, the middle being purely afferent, the superior being largely efferent, but not purely so. Of the old terminologies, the brachium pontus, the arms of the pons, and the only one that really is worth remembering is the brachium conjunctivum, which is the conjoined arms of the output of the cerebellum as it goes to the opposite red nucleus, and that picture ought to remind you of the major output of dentate, nucleus, superior peduncle, brachium conjunctivum, the opposite red nucleus up to the thalamus, like so. So brachium conjunctivum, so any questions about peduncles? I guess the next thing that I can tell you that's useful about the cerebellum, I remember at least, the clinically important part is that disorders of cerebellum result in incoordination. And that's where most of the clinical emphasis is laid. And the incoordination is ipsilateral, almost all the time. That relates to the fact that the cerebellum is connected to the segmental structures by systems that are essentially ipsilateral, such as spinocerebellar tract, dorsal, or there's a double crossing. If the output crosses to the opposite red nucleus, the cerebrospinal tract immediately crosses back. Because you could get, in the red nucleus, an opposite effect. So just as there's an occasional exception to the ipsilateral incoordination, you have to remember that there's also the other private pathway, the vestibular spinal system, oculonodular gravity system. It's the gravity system that is particularly involved in medulloblastomas, typically arise in the nodulus. And the alcoholic cerebellar atrophy affects the anterior vermis. So those two syndromes relate to stage 1 of the vestibular system, and all the rest essentially boil down to ipsilateral incoordination, a breaking down of the rapid communication of where a limb has been, where you want it to go, and so how you make it stop. And that would be the spindle system of the afferent relayed through inferior peduncle. The next thing I can tell you is easy, is that when you look at the cerebellum, it looks the same no matter where you look at it. The microscopic structure is identical no matter where you cut into it. And the unit is essentially a folium of cortex and white matter, which is a long, horizontally running in this plane at right angles to the board of gray matter that is divided. How many layers? 3, right. Molecular, the granular, Purkinje cell. And we're now up to 1837 when Purkinje saw this and recognized the 3 layers of the cerebellar cortex with a nice change here. A nice large cell body, branching dendrites, nucleus, an axon that comes down through the white matter. And it's through the dendrites of these Purkinje cells that are at right angles to the long axis of the folium that we have the cross-cut fibers of the horizontally running axons of granule cells that have their origin filling the granule cell layer. Axons go up and branch at right angles to the board and are coming through the dendrites of Purkinje cells like telephone wires to telephone poles. We have the next component, which is the input coming through the white matter ending in the granule cell layer as mossy fibers onto the short dendrites of the granule cells, making a little cluster there of axon dendritic connections. And so we have the major pathway through cerebellar cortex of an afferent, almost every place we're going to be talking about, has mossy fibers on the granule cell dendrites, granule cell axons up in the molecular layer, branching horizontally, running through the dendrites of Purkinje cells, Purkinje cell axons going down, and ending on a deep nucleus, which will inhibit deep nucleus cells, which will go out to the segmental, suprasegmental connections. And of course, is the input, the apparatus, which are coming from segmental or suprasegmental structures, and from the segmental apparatus, what part? Segmental association plate or suprasegmental structures. And oddly enough, most of the output back to the segments is going to be back to association plate also. It will be a general rule that the association plate gives rise to and receives from most of the other structures than purely segmental. There are going to be some obviously on the motor plate, but the large bulk of the connections are going to be to and fro, the exaggeration of the system being the stage 1 of the cerebellum, or vestibulo, nodular, floccular, intra-cortical connections, output down to the roof nucleus of this segment, this stage, and from the roof nucleus back to the pseudonucleus. So we're going to see shortly a very simple pathway that's going to be recapitulated in all the rest of them. Association plate to cerebellar cortex, through cerebellar cortex, down to deep nucleus, and back to association plate. So much of our discussion of the connections is going to be tracing these circuits, which we can anticipate beginning, coming back, and ending on approximately the same, not exactly the same, association plate elements. And those connections are going to be made through one or another of these speed elements. So any problems with the basic pathway, it's sort of forced by the way it develops. From something very close to association plate, it expands, retains its connection to that association plate, and as the rest of the nervous system develops, become more and more complicated, but still retains the desire, the basic input, embryologic input of making a circuit, amplifying what's happening, telling the association plate what should be happening at the segmental level to make things run smoothly. Now I should say a little bit about the deep nuclei. The deep nuclei are probably going to be best seen in a horizontal section through the adult brainstem, middle hindbrain, for example. Will look something like this. If we put the midline, the fourth ventricle, vascular groove, the separating tegmentum and basis pontus. Let's put in a vestibular nucleus, just an orientation, laterally here, lateral to the sulcus limitans. And let's grow the association plate, alar lips, up into the cerebellum. So we'll now have the inner cerebellum peduncle. Coming into the nodulus and curving around laterally so we can get into the flocculus out here. And into the nodulus, not the nodulus, there's going to be fleshy cortex up here. It's going to be almost split down the middle by the midline, so we have a right and left. This is the nodulus. These afferent fibers are going to end as mossy fibers on granule cells. Granule cells are going to provide the axons up to the Purkinje cell dendrites, like over there. And the Purkinje cells are going to fire back down. And so that part I'm going to leave out for simplicity. My colors here. But the Purkinje cell is going to project back down to the root nucleus, of which there are two. Latin called fastigium or fastigial nucleus, because fastigium is the root of the fourth ventricle. And the roof nucleus is going to project back through the inner peduncle to the vestibular nucleus. And so if I put in my Purkinje cell here, we have a Purkinje cell nodulus, dendrites, axons down, and inhibiting the root nucleus. That means I better have some granule cell axons running through these dendrites, coming from the granule cells, go up and branch at right angles. And so I put the mossy fiber now in red. Come in here. Granule cells. So I've changed my colors. We have the afferents through inner peduncle as mossy fibers, granule cells, Purkinje cell dendrites, Purkinje cell axon down to a deep nucleus, root ones, and out back to the vestibular nucleus. And so we have it. The same thing happens with flocculus. It's just drawn out to the side with afferents and efferents down to the nucleus. Next to the root nucleus, we have two other nuclei. Lobos and coliform. More intermediate. which are going to receive from Purkinje cell axons of cortex that's adjacent to the nodulus, the vermis, the paravermium. These Purkinje cells are going to get down to these nuclei. So vermis, which is the anatomical split, and paravermian cortex have very similar parallel projections down to rather small nuclei in the roof of the fourth ventricle. Exaggerated them. The roof nucleus might be in the order of 3-4 millimeters in diameter. You have to cut it exactly in the right plane or you miss it. Intermediate are slightly larger, but not much. But the one you can hardly miss is the dentate nucleus. It's a great big structure out here inside. Deep circle right now is the dentate. You can see it in almost every section of the gross section of the cerebellum. And it receives from Purkinje cells that inhibit from the lateral cerebellar cortex. So we have 3 sets of deep nuclei, 3 sets of cerebellar cortex. Vermian and roof, paravermian intermediate, and lateral, big bulk of cerebellar cortex. Dentate, big bulk of deep nucleus. And these are going to correspond pretty much to what we'll see as stages 1, 2, and 3. On the efferent side, taking the cerebellar cortex as the midpoint, with afferents coming in and efferents going out. Here we have the cortico-deep nuclear relationship for stages 1, 2, and 3. And if you followed so far, you should have picked up the fact that stage 1 of the cerebellum, vestibulo-nodular, vestibulo-floccular, and back down to root nucleus, has become just a little sloppy. Because the rest of the vermian cortex, not just the nodulus, all the rest of this vermis will project down onto the root nucleus. So we've taken a virtually pure vestibulo-cerebellar system, stage 1, and added something to it on the afferent side, but have kept the efferent system. And that's going to be true as we develop the whole cerebellum. And it means that you can't look at any particular part of the cerebellum and say this is stage 1, 2, or 3. Because there is roughly this sagittal, parasagittal layering of output. and roughly horizontal layering of input. I've only given you one piece of that horizontal input, and that's the vestibular. I'm going to see shortly that stage 2 in particular, comes in and layers out tail, leg, arm, head, and a recapitulation posteriorly, off mid-arm. So we have a series of horizontal inputs that overlap at right angles the vertical parasagittal outputs. That may seem to be a little sloppy way of doing it, and it took until about 1940 before Brodel recognized that that was the problem. That was the solution to the problem. Up until that point, the late 1890s, 1920s, 30s, the phylogenetic, physiologic attempts to force the cerebellum into archae, paleo, neo cerebellum were having trouble. And about 1940, Brodel saw this general pattern and saw what the problem was, that the input and the output were at right angles to each other. So while the vestibular input is rather restricted, its output is correspondingly restricted. The rest of the input from stages 2 and 3 to the vermis overlap on the output. So you can't really say, except for floccular nodular, which stays pretty private, stays pretty much vestibular of stage 1. You can't really pick any other piece of cortex and say that's stage 1. Stage 1 on the output, stage 2, and even stage 3 on the input. It changes your concept of architecture from the early part of the century, which tried to say this is old, this is next, this is new. As though you were building a house with a basement on the first floor and second floor. It's much easier to look at a more modern floor in which you have the front door, a hallway, and then not a doorway to the living room, dining room, but an open series of squares, 2 by 2 maybe, pieces of wood that form a frame and say this is the hallway and this is the living room that you can see through. And indeed, you can use the living room as a dining room because the kitchen's right over here and you can just change the function of it. But you can see all this in essentially a transparent, relatively modern floor plan, which you couldn't in the old scheme. This is a private bathroom over here. This is a private kitchen over here. And you just didn't talk to the two. Unless they haven't seen a modern design that's an open bathroom in the kitchen. So that's the general scheme of things on cerebellum. Any problems? There is one more problem. How many of you have had a chance to look at the short chapter I gave you? Because there I think I'm looking. The solution to another problem. When I was first-year medical student, we had Ransom. And the cerebellum was presented as something that looked like this. years to realize how that was made in the first place. Why they was thought it looked like the cerebellum. Looked like a rather stunted Christmas tree. But what it was, this is vermis, and paravermis, which wasn't labeled in those days, and lateral. This was nodulus and flocculus. And even that didn't help very much. So I realized that what they'd done was take a piece of paper, and starting at point A here, go around point B, and then unroll it. So point A was up here, point B was up here, and those two touched in the roof of the fourth ventricle. And then off to the side comes the lateral cortex, and essentially unconnected little piece of flocculus coming off to the side also. And that was sort of the classical representation of cerebral cortex. But then, a couple of decades ago, Breitenberg said, that's not exactly the way it looks. Because when you look at a cut section of the cerebellum, you realize that there are a large number of these folia. The nodulus turns around and comes back. There's the next lobule. And so on. All the way around. So that there's a tremendous distortion in this flank. The folia, recall, are running almost purely horizontally. So the width doesn't change. But the length is about 7 times. So if you try to reproduce it, you end up with something of the order of, okay, it'll just about fit here. A long, skinny thing. That is something of the order, it's more than a meter long. It's about 1,200 centimeters high. And about 17 centimeters wide. I think that's about right. And so, if you try to put that in the book, it means that your book has got to be 4 feet high. And what's that, about 7 inches wide? So you have an ordinary sized book this way. This way, it's awful. And all these little horizontally running folia, hundreds of them, are what have been now stretched out by taking each of these around and unfolding. So the dimensions, well, it's only 7 times as much cerebral cortex is buried and is exposed. Cerebral cortex is about twice as much buried as it is exposed. And unfortunately, there's not very much work to be done on mapping deeper cortex. So you still have big gaps in placing things on this map where they really are in this one. So, any problems at this point? I've now, in 4 minutes, given you the solution to a problem that took me 15 years, I guess, to understand. So I hope you appreciate it. Sure. Either that or you